You wake long before sunrise, not because you want to, but because something outside has already awakened. A distant growl rolls across the valley. Cold air slips through the narrow entrance of the cave, carrying the damp smell of wet stone, animal fur, and smoke left over from last night's fire. Water drips steadily somewhere behind you, each drop echoing through the darkness. As the first pale light reaches the cave mouth, you step outside and stare across an endless plain. The world beyond is full of food, rivers, forests, and opportunity. Yet every evening you must return to this same patch of rock. Or do you? Perhaps one of the greatest turning points in human history was not learning to live inside caves, but learning that caves were never enough. Archaeological evidence suggests that prehistoric people may have left them far earlier and far more often than most of us imagine, choosing instead to build shelters wherever life demanded. That simple decision may have transformed not only where humans slept, but how they explored, survived, and eventually reshaped the planet. For generations, caves have become one of the most recognizable symbols of prehistoric life. Movies fill them with roaring fires, painted walls, and families gathered around glowing embers while storms rage outside. It is an image so familiar that many people unconsciously assume ancient humans spent most of their lives underground. Yet archaeology tells a surprisingly different story. The reason caves dominate our imagination has less to do with how prehistoric people actually lived, and far more to do with what survives. Stone lasts. Wood rots. Animal hides decay. Branches disappear. If an ancient family built a shelter beside a river 40,000 years ago, almost nothing of it would remain today. But if that same family painted a cave wall or left tools on a stone floor, the cave protected those traces for thousands upon thousands of years. In many ways, caves have preserved history, while open landscapes quietly erased it. This creates a fascinating illusion. We discover countless remarkable caves because caves are excellent time capsules, not necessarily because they were humanity's favorite homes. Archaeologists have spent decades correcting this misunderstanding, as new excavation techniques reveal subtle clues hidden in ancient soils. Tiny post holes, patterns of stones, circular stains where wooden poles once stood, layers of ash that formed repeated camps rather than permanent settlements. Piece by piece, a different picture begins to emerge. Even famous decorated caves raise new questions. Places such as Lascaux in France and Chauvet contain breathtaking artwork. Yet many researchers believe these caves were not ordinary living spaces. Some chambers are deep underground, difficult to reach, poorly ventilated, and far from natural daylight. They appear better suited for rituals, symbolic activities, or occasional visits than for raising children day after day. The spectacular paintings survived precisely because relatively few people lived among them. If caves were not permanent homes, why did prehistoric people enter them at all? The answer is simple. Sometimes they were incredibly useful. A cave could provide immediate protection from freezing winds, heavy rain, or dangerous predators. It offered sturdy walls without cutting a single tree. Fire reflected warmth from solid rock, making cold nights more bearable. During harsh winters or violent storms, few shelters could compete with nature's own architecture. But advantages always came with costs. Suitable caves were surprisingly rare. Large caves with dry floors, good ventilation, nearby fresh water, and safe entrances existed only in certain landscapes. Entire regions contained almost no caves at all. If your hunting grounds shifted with migrating herds, staying beside one cave might mean walking enormous distances every day just to reach food. For highly mobile hunter-gatherers, that simply made little sense. This is where everything begins to change. Prehistoric humans were not passive creatures waiting for resources to appear around them. They followed animals, tracked seasonal plants, searched for stones suitable for tools, visited freshwater sources, and maintained connections with neighboring groups. Their lives were shaped by movement. A fixed cave could become less of an advantage and more of a limitation. Evidence from many Paleolithic sites shows repeated short-term occupations rather than continuous residence. Layers of hearth separated by long periods of abandonment suggest groups often return seasonally instead of living there year-round. In some caves, different animal species occupied the same shelter during periods when humans disappeared. The cave itself became shared real estate, used by whichever species happened to need it most. Imagine arriving after weeks of following reindeer across an open plain, only to discover that a family of cave bears had already claimed your shelter. Even after bears became less common, wolves, hyenas, lions, and other predators also recognized the value of protected rock shelters. Humans were not the only intelligent creatures searching for secure places to rest. Competition could become dangerous. Some archaeological sites preserve tooth marks on bones left by carnivores alongside human-made stone tools. Rather than proving peaceful coexistence, these discoveries remind us that caves often changed occupants repeatedly. Sometimes predators fed there before humans arrived, sometimes humans occupied the site first, sometimes neither stayed for very long. Then there was another challenge that is easy to overlook today. Caves rarely appeared exactly where people wanted to live. Hunter-gatherers depended on constantly changing landscapes. Fish gathered in rivers during particular seasons, herds migrated across grasslands, nuts ripened in forests, coastal resources changed with tides. Remaining tied to one rocky shelter could force people to travel farther every day simply to gather enough food. Those extra journeys consumed valuable energy while increasing exposure to weather and danger. For small bands living close to the edge of survival, efficiency mattered. Walking several additional kilometers every day might not sound dramatic to us, but over months and years, those unnecessary distances could shape whether children remained healthy, whether older adults could keep up with the group, and whether enough food returned to camp before darkness fell. The landscape itself was quietly teaching an important lesson. Safety was valuable, but flexibility could be even more valuable. Instead of asking, "Where is the nearest cave?" prehistoric people may gradually have begun asking a completely different question. How can we bring shelter wherever we go? That shift sounds almost ordinary today. We carry tents into mountains without thinking twice. Yet, for our ancestors, it represented a revolutionary idea. Home no longer had to be discovered. Perhaps, for the first time, home could be created. Archaeological evidence suggests that once humans realized they could construct reliable shelters from wood, branches, hides, and other natural materials, the world suddenly became much larger than the scattered caves that geology happened to provide. And the remarkable part is that the earliest clues to this transformation were hidden in the ground for hundreds of thousands of years, waiting for archaeologists to notice patterns that previous generations had overlooked. Those forgotten circles of soil would eventually reveal that the first true homes may never have been caves at all. For a long time, archaeologists searched for prehistoric homes in all the wrong places. They looked for walls, roofs, and foundations strong enough to survive thousands of years. Naturally, they kept finding caves. But the first true houses were never built to last forever. They were built to last long enough for the people living inside them. That simple realization changed everything. Instead of searching for standing structures, researchers began looking for almost invisible patterns beneath the ground. A ring of darker soil where wooden posts had once decayed. Stones arranged in circles that no river could have placed. Thin layers of charcoal surrounded by broken animal bones and stone tools. Individually, these traces seemed insignificant. Together, they revealed something extraordinary. People had been building shelters far earlier than anyone once believed. One of the most fascinating examples comes from a site called Terra Amata on the Mediterranean coast of southern France. Dating to roughly 400,000 years ago, the site contains evidence that some researchers interpret as the remains of oval huts. Archaeologists uncovered lines of stones that may have anchored wooden poles, along with hearths positioned inside these possible structures. The interpretation remains debated. Some scholars argue the evidence could have formed through natural processes, while others believe it represents one of the earliest known examples of deliberately constructed shelters. Regardless of where that debate eventually settles, Terra Amata reminds us that prehistoric people were already experimenting with shaping their environment instead of simply accepting it. That idea alone marks a profound shift. Rather than waiting for nature to provide a perfect shelter, humans were beginning to solve problems with planning. The same pattern appears elsewhere across Europe. At Bilzingsleben, in present-day Germany, archaeologists discovered circular arrangements of stones and activity areas dating back around 300,000 years. Although researchers continue to discuss exactly how these spaces were used, the evidence suggests repeated organization rather than random occupation. Different tasks seem to have taken place in different parts of the site, implying that early humans were already thinking about how living space should function. This may sound ordinary to us, but it represents something deeply human. Every home reflects choices. Where should the fire burn? Where should tools be repaired? Where should children sleep safely? Where should food be prepared? These are not simply questions of architecture. They are questions of planning, cooperation, and shared understanding. Once a group begins organizing space, that group is also organizing society. And perhaps that was the real invention. Not the shelter itself, but the invisible rules that grew around it. The story becomes even more remarkable as we move forward into the Upper Paleolithic. Across the cold plains of Ice Age Europe, caves became increasingly scarce in many regions. Yet people continued living there successfully. They simply built their own homes. Some of the most spectacular evidence comes from Mezhyrich in modern-day Ukraine. Around 15,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers constructed shelters using the bones of woolly mammoths. Massive skulls, jaws, tusks, and long leg bones formed sturdy frameworks that were likely covered with animal hides. To modern eyes, the structures appear almost unbelievable. Entire houses built from giant Ice Age animals. Yet the explanation is surprisingly practical. Wood was limited across parts of the frozen steppe. Mammoth bones, on the other hand, were abundant wherever successful hunts or natural deaths occurred. Rather than seeing bones as waste, prehistoric people transformed them into valuable building materials. It was an elegant solution, created from whatever the landscape offered. Excavations around these mammoth bone dwellings reveal hearths, storage pits, stone tools, ivory working areas, and countless fragments of daily life. These were not temporary hiding places used for a single night. They appear to have served as seasonal homes where families lived, repaired equipment, processed food, and prepared for future journeys. The shelter itself became part of a much larger system. It protected fire, it stored resources, it allowed people to remain in one location longer than an open campsite would have permitted. That extra time changed everything. A reliable shelter meant fewer hours spent constantly searching for protection from wind and snow. Those saved hours could instead be invested elsewhere. Making better tools, repairing clothing, teaching children, planning hunts, creating ornaments. Perhaps even telling stories around the fire that preserve knowledge from one generation to the next. This is one of the most overlooked consequences of architecture. A shelter does more than protect the body. It protects time. And time may have been one of humanity's most valuable resources. Not every prehistoric home was as dramatic as a mammoth bone structure, of course. Most were probably built from wooden poles, flexible branches, grasses, reeds, bark, and animal hides. Unfortunately, these materials disappear quickly after abandonment, leaving only faint archaeological signatures. That is why finding ancient shelters requires remarkable patience. Researchers often identify them through microscopic changes in soil chemistry, tiny concentrations of charcoal, pollen analysis, or subtle patterns of buried post holes that would be invisible to almost anyone else. In other words, the greatest prehistoric houses are often the ones we cannot actually see. Ironically, their disappearance once convinced people they had never existed. But new technologies continue revealing evidence hidden beneath ancient landscapes. Ground-penetrating radar, refined excavation methods, microscopic sediment analysis, and experimental archaeology all help researchers reconstruct structures that vanished tens of thousands of years ago. Each discovery tells the same quiet story. Human beings were becoming engineers. Not engineers with blueprints or mathematics, engineers of survival. Every shelter represented hundreds of small decisions. Which branches bend without breaking? Which hides block the wind most effectively? How steep should the roof be so rain runs away? How can smoke escape while warmth remains inside? None of these answers appeared overnight. Each generation probably inherited ideas from the one before, improving designs through experience, failure, observation, and memory. Long before written language existed, architecture itself may have become a form of accumulated knowledge. Every shelter carried lessons from ancestors its builders would never meet. And once humans realized they could build dependable homes almost anywhere, a remarkable possibility emerged. If home no longer depended on finding the perfect cave, then perhaps entire landscapes that had once seemed impossible to inhabit were suddenly within reach. That simple idea would eventually push our species far beyond forests and valleys, into frozen tundras, vast grasslands, wind-swept coasts, and environments where nature had never offered a cave at all. And it was the changing climate of the Ice Age that would force this new way of thinking to prove its true value. The Ice Age is often imagined as a world buried beneath endless snow. In reality, much of it looked very different. Vast grasslands stretched across enormous distances, interrupted by frozen rivers, scattered forests, and windswept plains. For prehistoric humans, this landscape offered incredible opportunities. It also presented one enormous problem. There were almost no caves. As glaciers expanded and climates shifted, people followed the animals they depended on. Mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer, and other large herbivores migrated across open steppe environments that sometimes extended for hundreds of kilometers without a single natural rock shelter. If humans wanted to survive there, they faced a simple choice: either remain near the few available caves and give up access to valuable hunting grounds, or learn how to carry home with them. Archaeological evidence suggests they chose the second option. This decision may appear obvious today, but it required an extraordinary leap in thinking. A cave is passive. You discover it. A shelter is active. You imagine it before it exists, gather materials, organize labor, and transform empty space into protection. That is not merely construction, it is planning. And planning became one of humanity's greatest evolutionary advantages. Unlike many other animals, humans rarely evolved specialized bodies for surviving every environment. We did not develop thick fur like musk oxen. We did not grow powerful claws for digging dens. We could not hibernate through winter. Instead, we adapted by changing the world around us. Every branch tied into place, every hide stretched across a wooden frame, every stone holding down the edge of a shelter, each represented another small victory of intelligence over environment. Some researchers describe this process as niche construction. Rather than adapting only through biological evolution, humans increasingly modified their surroundings to make survival easier. Clothing, fire, tools, and shelters all became extensions of the human body itself. A well-built shelter could create a warmer, safer microenvironment even when freezing winds swept across the surrounding plain. In a sense, humans were beginning to manufacture their own climate. Fire played an equally important role. Inside an enclosed shelter, even a relatively small hearth could dramatically improve comfort during cold weather. Heat reflected from hides or walls instead of disappearing into the open air. Smoke helped discourage insects, and perhaps even some predators. Wet clothing could dry overnight. Meat could be protected from scavengers more effectively than on an exposed campsite. The shelter and the fire worked together as a single survival system. Neither reached its full potential without the other. But climate was not the only reason these structures mattered. Mobility remained essential. Hunter-gatherers rarely wandered randomly across landscapes. Their movements followed seasonal rhythms that repeated year after year. Certain valleys offered migrating reindeer during autumn. Rivers filled with spawning fish at predictable times. Plants ripened in familiar locations every spring. Over generations, people learned these natural calendars with astonishing precision. Portable or quickly constructed shelters allowed them to remain flexible enough to follow these opportunities without sacrificing protection. Instead of forcing nature to come to them, they moved with nature itself. This may explain why prehistoric humans eventually occupied environments that many other large mammals struggled to exploit. Wherever useful resources appeared, humans gradually learned to establish temporary homes. Along rivers, near lakes, across windswept tundra, beside forests, even on exposed coastlines. The shelter transformed every promising landscape into a possible place to live. This expansion carried another remarkable consequence. Knowledge became more valuable than strength. Imagine two hunting groups entering the same unfamiliar valley. One group knows how to recognize flexible willow branches, waterproof animal hides, and the safest locations above seasonal flood levels. The other does not. Their physical abilities might be identical, yet one group survives far more comfortably than the other. The difference lies not in muscle, but in information. Generation after generation, prehistoric communities accumulated this knowledge through observation, memory, teaching, and experience. Children did not simply inherit genes, they inherited survival techniques. How to choose a campsite, how to face an entrance away from prevailing winds, how to prevent rainwater from flowing beneath sleeping areas, how to reinforce walls before winter storms. These lessons may have been repeated thousands of times around evening fires. Most disappeared without leaving written records. Yet they may represent one of the oldest educational traditions in human history. Shelters also changed the relationship between people and possessions. A highly mobile group cannot carry everything. Every additional object consumes energy. But once reliable camps became possible, some items no longer needed to travel constantly. Useful stone could be stored. Firewood could be gathered in advance. Food might remain protected for short periods. Repair work could continue over several days. Life became slightly less dependent on immediate improvisation. Small changes like these accumulate. A little more security, a little more efficiency, a little more time. Over thousands of generations, those small advantages helped shape civilizations that their builders could never have imagined. Yet perhaps the greatest transformation happened inside the shelter itself. For the first time, people were not merely surviving together, they were living together. The shelter created a shared space that belonged not to the landscape, but to the group. It encouraged cooperation beyond the hunt. Parents could care for infants, while others repaired tools. Older individuals could contribute knowledge even after their hunting years ended. Meals became opportunities for communication, rather than hurried moments between constant movement. Some anthropologists suggest that these repeated social interactions may have strengthened cultural traditions, teaching, and perhaps even increasingly sophisticated language. Whether every detail unfolded exactly this way remains impossible to prove. Organic shelters rarely survive. Words spoken around ancient fires vanished forever. But archaeology continues revealing one consistent pattern. As shelters became more reliable, human communities appear to have become more organized, and with stronger communities came something even more powerful than protection from cold or rain: a shared idea of home. That invisible idea would eventually outlast every wooden pole, every stretched hide, and every mammoth bone. Because once people no longer depended on caves, they also began depending far more on one another. And that may have been the strongest shelter our species ever built. You stand once again at the mouth of the cave. The morning air feels just as cold as it did before. The wind still carries the scent of damp earth, distant animals, and fading smoke. Nothing about the landscape seems to have changed, but everything about the people has. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another family is not searching for a cave tonight. They are gathering branches beside a river. Children are collecting bundles of grass. Hunters return carrying hides that will soon become walls instead of clothing. Before darkness falls, an empty patch of ground will become a home. Not because nature provided one, because human imagination did. That quiet transformation may seem almost insignificant compared with inventions like agriculture, metalworking, or writing. Yet many of those later achievements depended on something much simpler: the ability to choose where life could happen. Once people no longer relied entirely on natural shelters, they gained a freedom that few other species had ever possessed. They could remain close to migrating animals, camp beside seasonal rivers, occupy open coastlines, cross windswept plains, eventually settle landscapes that previous generations might never have considered inhabitable. Every temporary shelter expanded the map of the human world. Archaeology also suggests that these shelters gradually became more than places to escape bad weather. Repeated camps turned into familiar gathering places. Seasonal occupations became traditions. Certain locations were revisited year after year. Knowledge accumulated. Paths became remembered. Landscapes acquired meaning. A place was no longer simply where people happened to survive. It became somewhere they belonged. Perhaps this was the beginning of one of humanity's most remarkable relationships: our relationship with place. Long before cities existed, long before permanent villages, long before walls of stone or baked brick, people had already begun creating invisible homes made from memory, cooperation, and shared experience. The physical shelter protected them from the environment, but the social shelter protected something equally valuable: community. This helps explain why the story of prehistoric shelters is not really about architecture at all. It is about adaptation. Again and again throughout history, humans entered unfamiliar environments that seemed impossible at first. Frozen tundras, dense forests, mountain valleys, deserts, remote islands. Each time, survival depended less on finding the perfect landscape than on learning how to reshape imperfect ones. The shelter became one expression of a much larger pattern. Whenever nature presented a challenge, humans increasingly responded with creativity rather than biology. We built instead of evolving thicker fur. We stitched clothing instead of growing feathers. We controlled fire instead of waiting for warmer climates. We constructed homes instead of searching endlessly for caves. That pattern has never truly disappeared. Modern apartments, skyscrapers, research stations in Antarctica, underwater habitats, and even spacecraft all follow the same ancient principle. Humans survive extraordinary places by building environments that allow ordinary life to continue. In many ways, every house standing today carries a tiny echo of those forgotten shelters built from branches and animal hides tens of thousands of years ago. Of course, many questions remain unanswered. Organic materials rarely survive. Archaeological discoveries continue to reshape our understanding. New excavation techniques reveal evidence that previous generations could not detect. Some sites challenge old assumptions, others raise entirely new debates. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is one of archaeology's greatest strengths. Every discovery reminds us that history is not frozen. It continues evolving as new evidence emerges. Perhaps the greatest lesson is surprisingly simple. Prehistoric humans did not conquer the world because they found the perfect home. They succeeded because they learned how to create one. Wherever they traveled, whatever climate confronted them, whatever challenges stood before them, home became something they carried in knowledge rather than stone. So the next time you imagine prehistoric life, perhaps do not picture people spending every night deep inside a cave. Instead, picture a small shelter standing alone beneath an open sky. A fire glowing softly behind walls of stretched hide. Children falling asleep while the wind sweeps across the plain outside. Parents quietly repairing tools for tomorrow's hunt. Stories passing from one generation to another beneath a roof that will disappear long before history remembers it. No trace of that shelter may survive. The wood will decay, the hides will return to the earth, the grass roof will vanish with the seasons. But one invisible invention will remain: the idea that humans could shape the world instead of simply accepting it. That idea built the first shelter. It later built villages, cities, civilizations, and eventually the modern world itself. Because perhaps the greatest home our ancestors ever constructed was never made from wood, stone, or bone. It was built from imagination. And that is a shelter humanity has never truly